What could bring the most powerful man in the world to his knees, literally eating grass like an animal? Crawling through fields with wild beasts, his mind shattered and his glory stripped away. This isn't fiction. This is the true story of Nebuchadnezzar, the emperor who built the Hanging Gardens, conquered nations and ruled over the greatest empire of his time. He had everything: unlimited power, unimaginable wealth, and a kingdom that stretched to the horizon. But one fatal flaw would cost him his humanity. For 7 years, the king who once commanded millions would live as a beast, his hair growing like feathers, his nails like claws. His sanity vanished. What sin could trigger such a devastating judgment? What supernatural forces intervened in his palace? And most surprisingly, how did this broken man rise again to tell his own story? Today, we're diving into one of the Bible's most shocking transformations, where pride meets divine power and an emperor learns the hardest lesson of his life. Stay with us, because this journey will challenge everything you think you know about power, humility, and second chances. The year was 605 BC, and the ancient world was about to witness the rise of a king whose name would echo through the centuries. Nebuchadnezzar wasn't born into power by accident. He earned it through blood and conquest. While his father Nabopolassar ruled Babylon, the young prince led armies across distant lands, crushing enemies and expanding borders with ruthless efficiency. When news arrived that his father had died, Nebuchadnezzar raced back to Babylon. There was no time for hesitation, no room for weakness. The throne was his, and he took it with the confidence of a man who had never known defeat on the battlefield. He was young, ambitious, and hungry for more than what his father had left him. The empire he inherited was already powerful, but Nebuchadnezzar saw something greater. He looked at Babylon and imagined a city that would make the entire world stop and stare. He dreamed of monuments that would last forever, of walls so thick that no enemy could ever break them down. This wasn't just about ruling. It was about legacy, about becoming a name that people would never forget. Nebuchadnezzar transformed Babylon into something the world had never seen before. Massive construction projects began immediately. Workers flooded the city, stone by stone, raising structures that seemed to touch the sky. The king wanted everyone who entered his capital to feel small, to understand that they stood in the presence of absolute power. The most famous of his creations were the Hanging Gardens, built high above the city streets. Some say he made them for his wife, who missed the green mountains of her homeland. These gardens weren't planted in the ground. They rose on terraces, level after level, with trees and flowers cascading down like a green waterfall in the middle of the desert. Water flowed through them in ways that seemed impossible, and people traveled from distant lands just to see if the stories were true. But the gardens were just the beginning. The Ishtar Gate stood as the grand entrance to the city, covered in brilliant blue tiles that gleamed in the sun. Images of dragons and bulls decorated its surface, each one carefully crafted to display Babylon's might. When foreign kings passed through those gates, they knew immediately that they had entered a place unlike any other. The city walls were so wide that chariots could race along the top. Temples rose throughout Babylon, dedicated to the gods of his people. The king's palace sprawled across vast courtyards, room after room, filled with treasures from conquered nations. Nebuchadnezzar wanted the world to see what human ambition could achieve, and Babylon became his masterpiece. Not everyone accepted Babylonian rule quietly. Far to the west, in the small kingdom of Judah, King Jehoiakim made a decision that would cost his people everything. He had been paying tribute to Babylon, sending gold and silver to keep Nebuchadnezzar satisfied. But then he stopped. He rebelled, thinking perhaps that Babylon was too far away to care or too busy with other conquests to notice. He was wrong. Nebuchadnezzar's army marched toward Jerusalem with the fury of an insulted emperor. The siege was brutal and efficient. The Babylonian soldiers surrounded the city, cutting off food and water, waiting for Jerusalem to surrender. And it did. The book of 2 Kings chapter 24 verse 10 tells us, "At that time the officers of Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon advanced on Jerusalem and laid siege to the city. When the city fell, Nebuchadnezzar didn't just take territory, he took everything of value." Verse 13 records, "As the Lord had declared, Nebuchadnezzar removed the treasures from the temple of the Lord and from the royal palace, and cut up the gold articles that Solomon king of Israel had made for the temple of the Lord." But treasures weren't enough. The king wanted to break Jerusalem's spirit completely. He took the best and brightest of Judah's people, the nobles, the craftsmen, the warriors, anyone with skill or intelligence. Verse 14 says, "He carried all Jerusalem into exile, all the officers and fighting men, and all the skilled workers and artisans, a total of 10,000. Only the poorest people of the land were left." Among those captives were 4 young men whose names would become central to Nebuchadnezzar's story: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They were taken from everything they knew and brought to Babylon as prisoners, though they were treated better than most. The king had plans for them. Years passed, and Nebuchadnezzar's empire grew stronger. But then something happened that all his power couldn't control. One night, a dream came to him. Not an ordinary dream, but something that grabbed hold of his mind and wouldn't let go. He woke up in his bed, his heart racing, sweat covering his skin, filled with a terror he couldn't explain. The worst part wasn't the fear. It was that he couldn't remember what he'd seen. The images had been so vivid, so real, but now they slipped away like smoke. He knew the dream was important, maybe even dangerous, but the details were gone. All that remained was this overwhelming sense that something significant had been revealed to him, and he'd lost it. Daniel, chapter 2, verse 1, describes this moment. "In the 2nd year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled, and he could not sleep. The king did what powerful men do when they face something they can't control. He demanded answers from everyone around him. He summoned every wise man in Babylon, every magician, every person who claimed to have special knowledge. These were the men who were supposed to understand mysteries, who read the stars and interpreted signs. Surely they could help him. But Nebuchadnezzar wasn't in a patient mood. He made an impossible demand. As verse 5 records, the king replied to the astrologers, "This is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble." He didn't just want an interpretation, he wanted them to tell him the dream itself. Any fool could make up a meaning for a dream once they heard it. The king wanted proof that these men actually had access to supernatural knowledge. "Tell me what I dreamed," he said, "and then tell me what it means." The wise men panicked. This was impossible, and they said so. Verse 10 captures their desperation. The astrologers answered the king, "There is no one on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer." Nebuchadnezzar's rage erupted. If they couldn't do this simple thing, then what good were they? Verse 12 tells us, "This made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon." The decree went out immediately. Every wise man in the kingdom would die, including Daniel and his friends. When the king's guards came to arrest Daniel and execute him along with all the other wise men, Daniel didn't panic. He asked a simple question: why was the king's decree so urgent? The commander explained everything: the dream, the impossible demand, the king's fury. Daniel listened carefully, then made a bold request. He asked to see the king himself. Standing before Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel did something remarkable. He didn't promise that he could reveal the dream through his own power or wisdom. Instead, verse 16 says, Daniel went in to the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. He asked for time, and somehow in the middle of his rage, the king agreed. Daniel went straight to his three friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, though the Babylonians had given them new names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He told them everything, and then they did the only thing they could do. Verse 17 and 18 record, "Then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. They prayed. 4 young men, far from home, captives in a foreign land, asked their God to reveal what the most powerful empire on earth couldn't figure out. And that night, God answered." Verse 19 tells us, "During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Daniel saw everything, the exact dream that had tormented Nebuchadnezzar, every detail that the king had forgotten, and more importantly, what it all meant. His response wasn't to run immediately to the king and claim credit. First, he praised God. Verses 20 through 23 record his prayer. "Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and raises up others. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank and praise you, God of my ancestors. You have given me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what we asked of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king." Then Daniel went to Arioch, the commander in charge of executing the wise men. His words were direct and confident. Verse 24 says, "Do not execute the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king, and I will interpret his dream for him." When Daniel stood before Nebuchadnezzar, he made sure the king understood where this knowledge came from. Verse 27 and 28 record his words, "No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come." Now came the moment of truth. Could this young Jewish captive really tell the king what he had dreamed? Daniel didn't hesitate. He began to describe exactly what Nebuchadnezzar had seen in his sleep, detail by detail, as if he had been standing in the king's bedroom that night. Verse 31 records Daniel's words, "Your Majesty looked, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance." The king's eyes must have widened. Yes, that was it, the statue. But Daniel kept going, describing things the king had forgotten, but now came flooding back. The head of the statue was made of pure gold. Daniel continued in verse 32, "Its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay." The image became clearer with every word. This wasn't just any statue, it was massive, gleaming, powerful. Each section was made of a different metal, arranged from top to bottom, from the most valuable to the least. The statue represented something important, something about kingdoms and power, though the king didn't understand it yet. But the dream didn't end with the statue just standing there. Something dramatic happened next, and Daniel described it perfectly. Verse 34 says, "While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then came the destruction." Verse 35 continues, "Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken to pieces and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace, but the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth." Nebuchadnezzar sat frozen. This was exactly what he had seen. The enormous statue, the mysterious stone, the complete destruction. and the mountain that grew to fill everything. Daniel had done the impossible. He had revealed the dream that even the king himself had forgotten. But now came the harder part. What did it all mean? Daniel didn't make the king wait. He moved directly from describing the dream to explaining its meaning, and what he said next would have made any king's heart swell with pride. Verse 37 records Daniel's words, "Your Majesty, you are the King of Kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory." This wasn't empty flattery. Daniel was stating a fact. Nebuchadnezzar ruled the greatest empire on earth. No one could challenge his authority. His armies were unbeatable. His treasury overflowed with wealth. His capital city was the wonder of the world. But Daniel made sure the king understood where that power came from, not from Nebuchadnezzar's own strength, but as a gift from the God of heaven. Verse 38 continues, "In your hands he has placed all mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds in the sky. Wherever they live, he has made you ruler over them all. You are that head of gold, the most precious metal, the highest position on the statue." Nebuchadnezzar was the first and greatest of the kingdoms that would rise and fall throughout history. No empire that came after him would match his glory. It was the kind of declaration that would make any ruler feel invincible. But the dream didn't stop with the golden head, and neither did the interpretation. Verse 39 explains what came next. "After you, another kingdom will arise, inferior to yours. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth." Daniel was careful here. He didn't name these future kingdoms. He simply said they would exist. The silver chest and arms represented a kingdom that would follow Babylon, but it would be inferior, less glorious. Then would come a bronze kingdom that would have wide reach, but still not match the golden age of Nebuchadnezzar. The king was hearing that his empire, as magnificent as it was, wouldn't last forever. Other powers would rise. Then came the fourth kingdom, described in verse 40. "Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything, and as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. This kingdom would be brutal, powerful, crushing everything in its path like iron. But even it would have a fatal weakness." Verse 41 and 42 continue, "Just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom. Yet it will have some of the strength of iron in it, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. As the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle." The mixed feet, part iron, part clay, represented a kingdom that couldn't hold together. Verse 43 explains, "And just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay." Then came the most important part of the entire interpretation. The stone that destroyed the statue wasn't just a random detail. It represented something far greater than any human empire. Verse 44 declares, "In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever." This was the ultimate message. Human kingdoms rise and fall, strong today and gone tomorrow. But God's kingdom would come and would never end. The mountain that filled the whole earth represented a rule that would outlast every empire, every king, every human attempt at power. Verse 45 concludes, "This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands, a rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver and the gold to pieces. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true and its interpretation is trustworthy." Nebuchadnezzar's reaction was immediate and shocking. This was a king who demanded that people bow before him, who executed those who failed to meet his demands, who saw himself as the ultimate authority. But now, faced with this revelation, something shifted inside him. Verse 46 tells us, "Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honor and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. The king of Babylon, the head of gold, fell on his face before a young Jewish captive. It was an extraordinary moment. He commanded that offerings be made to Daniel, though Daniel certainly would have redirected that worship to God alone. The king wasn't honoring Daniel's wisdom, he was responding to the power behind Daniel's words. Then Nebuchadnezzar spoke words that must have surprised everyone in the throne room. Verse 47 records what he said, "Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery." This was more than just polite acknowledgement. The king was declaring that Daniel's God stood above all other gods, including the deities of Babylon. He called him the God of gods and the Lord of kings, recognizing a power greater than his own. He acknowledged that only this God could reveal mysteries that human wisdom couldn't touch. But notice what the king didn't say. He didn't say, "Your God is now my God." He didn't declare that he would stop worshipping the gods of Babylon. He recognized the power and supremacy of the God of heaven, but he kept his distance. It was respect, even awe, but not surrender. Not yet. The king's response didn't stop with words. Verse 48 says, "Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all its wise men." Daniel went from being a captive facing execution to being the highest official in the empire, second only to the king himself. The same wise men who couldn't help Nebuchadnezzar now answered to this young man who served a different God. Daniel didn't forget his friends. Verse 49 records, "Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court." Here it is. The four young men who had prayed together now served together in positions of power. Foreigners ruling over Babylonians, captives placed above their captors. Time passed after the dream of the statue, and something changed in Nebuchadnezzar's heart. Perhaps the interpretation had bothered him more than he showed, the idea that his kingdom wouldn't last, that other empires would follow, that he was just the beginning of a story and not its conclusion. Whatever the reason, the king decided to make a statement that would echo across his entire empire. Daniel chapter 3 verse 1 tells us what he did. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. This wasn't a small statue tucked away in a temple. It was 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide, towering over the flat plain where everyone could see it from miles away. The entire thing was covered in gold, gleaming under the sun, like a second sun had risen from the earth. Nobody knows exactly what the image represented. Some think it was a statue of Nebuchadnezzar himself. Others believe it depicted one of Babylon's gods. Maybe it was a response to that dream, a golden image to rival the golden head, a way of saying his kingdom would last forever, despite what the interpretation suggested. The Bible doesn't tell us what it looked like, only that it was massive, golden, and impossible to ignore. The location mattered too. The plain of Dura was an open space where crowds could gather, where the statue would be visible from every direction. This wasn't meant to be a private monument. It was a public declaration of power, a physical reminder of who ruled Babylon and what he expected from everyone under his authority. But building the statue was only the beginning. Nebuchadnezzar wanted more than just people looking at it. He wanted them to worship it, so he issued a decree that would test the loyalty of every person in his empire. Verse 2 and 3 describe what happened next. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Every important person from every corner of the empire received a command to attend. This wasn't optional. Officials who ruled distant provinces, judges who decided legal matters, treasurers who managed the kingdom's wealth. Everyone who held any position of authority had to be there. They gathered on the plain of Dura, standing before this golden giant, waiting to hear what the king required. Then a herald stepped forward and made the announcement. Verse 4 and 5 record his words. "This is what you are commanded to do, you nations and peoples of every language. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up." The command was simple and absolute. When the music played, everyone had to bow. It didn't matter who you were, where you came from, or what you believed. The moment those instruments began to sound, every knee had to hit the ground in worship of the golden image. There were no exceptions written into the decree, no allowances for personal conscience or religious belief. But the herald wasn't finished. Verse 6 added the consequence for disobedience. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. The threat wasn't subtle or delayed. Refuse to bow, and you would be burned alive on the spot. A furnace had been prepared specifically for this purpose, heated and ready, visible to everyone gathered there as a reminder of what defiance would cost. This was Nebuchadnezzar demanding total submission, not just political loyalty, but religious devotion. Every person had to choose in that moment whether they would obey the king or hold on to whatever beliefs they had brought with them to the plain. The moment arrived. Verse 7 describes what happened. Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. The music filled the air, and like a wave moving across the plain, thousands of people dropped to their knees. Governors, officials, leaders from every nation under Babylonian control, all of them bowed before the golden statue, all except three. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego remained standing. These were the same men Daniel had requested to be appointed as administrators, the friends who had prayed with him when the king demanded someone interpret his dream. They held high positions in the government now, but they served a God who had commanded them never to bow before any image or idol. So while an entire empire worshipped around them, they stood. It didn't take long for someone to notice. Verse 8 tells us, "At this time some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews." The word denounced is important. This wasn't a casual observation. These astrologers went directly to the king with accusations, and their motives weren't pure. These were likely the same wise men who had almost been executed when they couldn't interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the ones who now answered to Daniel and his friends. They saw an opportunity to bring down these foreigners who had been placed above them. Verse 9 through 12 record their accusation. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. Your Majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your Majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up." Notice how they framed it. They reminded the king that he had given these men positions of power, then accused them of showing no respect for his authority. They weren't just breaking a religious law, they were defying the king himself, the man who had elevated them from captives to rulers. The accusation was designed to provoke Nebuchadnezzar's anger and make this personal. The accusation hit its mark. Verse 13 tells us, "Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." The king, who had once honored Daniel's God, who had fallen on his face in recognition of divine power, now burned with anger at these three Jews who refused to obey his command. This was about more than religion. It was about authority, about whether anyone could say no to the king of Babylon. When the three men stood before him, Nebuchadnezzar didn't immediately throw them into the furnace. Instead, he gave them a chance, perhaps because of their positions, perhaps because of their connection to Daniel. Verse 14 and 15 record what he said. "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace." The king was offering them a second chance. The music would play again, and they could bow like everyone else. All would be forgiven, and they could keep their positions and their lives. It was a way out, a chance to save themselves with a simple act of obedience. But then Nebuchadnezzar added something that revealed what this was really about. The end of verse 15 says, "Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" This was a challenge, not just to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but to their God. The king was essentially saying that his power was absolute, that no deity could stand against him, that the furnace was final. He had forgotten, or perhaps chosen to ignore, the lesson he should have learned from Daniel's interpretation of his dream. The three men didn't hesitate. They didn't ask for time to think or try to negotiate a compromise. Their answer was immediate and clear. Verse 16 through 18 record their response. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." These words carried a weight that must have silenced the entire gathering. The three men weren't being reckless or suicidal. They believed their God could save them from the fire. They had confidence in his power to deliver them even from a furnace heated to kill. But more than that, they made something even more radical clear. Even if God chose not to rescue them, even if they burned, they still wouldn't bow. This was faith without conditions. They weren't serving God because they expected him to always make their lives easy or safe. They served him because he was worthy of their worship, regardless of what happened to them. The king had asked what God could rescue them from his hand, and they answered that their God could. But that wasn't the point. The point was that some things matter more than survival. Their answer also drew a sharp line. They called Nebuchadnezzar "Your Majesty" with respect, but they made it clear they would not serve his gods or worship his image. They acknowledged his political authority while refusing to give him religious devotion. There was no compromise available, no middle ground where they could partially obey and partially remain faithful to their beliefs. Nebuchadnezzar's reaction was immediate and extreme. Verse 19 describes what happened. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. The king, who had given them a second chance, now wanted them to suffer maximally. Heating the furnace 7 times hotter wasn't about efficiency. It was about rage, about making an example, about showing everyone what happened when someone defied him. The number 7 appears repeatedly in the Bible as a number of completeness or perfection. By ordering the furnace heated 7 times beyond its normal temperature, Nebuchadnezzar was essentially saying, "Make it as hot as it can possibly be." He wanted these men not just killed, but destroyed, consumed so completely that nothing would remain. Verse 20 continues, "And he commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace." He didn't send ordinary guards for this task. He sent the strongest soldiers he had. These 3 men needed to be bound so securely that they couldn't escape, couldn't fight back, couldn't do anything but fall into the flames. The execution began immediately. Verse 21 tells us, "So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. There was no time given for them to prepare or say final words. They were tied up fully clothed and thrown into the fire while everyone watched. Their expensive robes, the clothes that marked them as government officials, would burn with them." But then something unexpected happened, not to the 3 men, but to the soldiers. Verse 22 records, "The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The very men tasked with executing the sentence died in the process. The furnace had been heated so far beyond reason that just approaching it was fatal. The flames reached out and consumed the soldiers before they could even step back to safety. This detail matters. It showed that the fire was real and absolutely deadly. This wasn't some trick or illusion. The furnace was so hot that strong, trained warriors died just from being near it. Anyone thrown into that inferno should have been incinerated instantly. Verse 23 confirms, "And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace." The 3 men disappeared into the flames, and that should have been the end of the story. But King Nebuchadnezzar was watching, and suddenly something made him jump to his feet. Verse 24 describes his reaction. "Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, 'Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?' They replied, 'Certainly, Your Majesty.'" The king needed confirmation because what he was seeing didn't make sense. His advisors confirmed it. Yes, 3 men had been thrown in, bound and helpless. But that's not what Nebuchadnezzar was seeing now. Verse 25 records his words. He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." 4 men, not 3. And they weren't lying down dead or screaming in agony. They were walking around inside the furnace as if they were taking a stroll through a garden. The ropes that had bound them so tightly were gone, burned away, while the men themselves remained untouched. They were moving freely in the midst of flames that had killed trained soldiers just from proximity. But the most stunning detail was the 4th figure. Nebuchadnezzar could see someone else in there with them, someone who hadn't been thrown into the fire. He described this person as looking like a son of the gods, a divine being, someone who didn't belong to the ordinary world. The king, watching from outside the furnace, could tell that whoever this 4th person was, he was different from any human. The Bible doesn't explicitly tell us who the 4th figure was, but many believe it was a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ, a moment when God himself stepped into the fire with his faithful servants. What we know for certain is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not alone in their suffering. The same God they had refused to abandon had not abandoned them. Nebuchadnezzar approached the furnace as close as he dared, considering what had happened to his soldiers. Verse 26 tells us what he did. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out. Come here." The king who had thrown them in as enemies now called them servants of the Most High God. He used the same title for their God that Daniel had used, recognizing supreme authority and power. The three men walked out of the furnace. Verse 26 continues, "So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. They walked out the same way they had walked around inside, calmly, under their own power, alive and whole. But the real miracle became clear when people gathered around them to look closely." Verse 27 describes what everyone saw. "And the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them." Every official who had watched them get thrown into the furnace now surrounded them in shock. These men should have been ash. Instead, they looked exactly as they had before. No burns, no injuries, not even minor damage. The details pile up to emphasize how complete the protection was. Not a single hair on their heads had been burned, and hair burns easily. Their robes, the same expensive clothes they had been wearing, showed no signs of scorching. Most remarkably, they didn't even smell like smoke. Anyone who has been near a fire knows that the smell clings to clothes and hair for days. These men had been inside a furnace, heated 7 times hotter than normal, and they came out smelling like they'd never been near a flame. The fire had been selective. It burned the ropes that bound them, giving them freedom. It killed the soldiers who threw them in, proving its deadly power, but it didn't touch a single hair on the heads of these 3 men who had refused to bow. The message was unmistakable. The God they served was more powerful than any furnace, any king, any threat the empire could produce. Nebuchadnezzar responded immediately. Verse 28 records his words. "Then Nebuchadnezzar said, 'Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God.' And the king praised their God openly, acknowledging that an angel had been sent to rescue them. He also acknowledged what had really happened. These men had defied his command, had been willing to die rather than compromise their faith. Then he issued a new decree. Verse 29 says, "Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." The king who had demanded everyone worship his golden image now threatened death to anyone who spoke against the God of the Jews. He recognized that what he had witnessed wasn't normal, wasn't explainable by any power he knew. Finally, verse 30 tells us, "Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. They didn't just survive their stand for faith, they were elevated even higher in the kingdom. The men who had been sentenced to death for defiance now received greater authority and honor than before. Years passed after the incident with the furnace. Nebuchadnezzar continued to rule Babylon with absolute power, his empire expanding, his building projects continuing to amaze the world. But then, once again, a dream came to him in the night, and this time, the king knew immediately that it mattered. Daniel chapter 4 contains Nebuchadnezzar's own account of what happened, written as a proclamation to his entire kingdom. Verse 4 and 5 describe the moment. "I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous. I had a dream that made me afraid. As I was lying in bed, the images and visions that passed through my mind terrified me. So, unlike the first dream where he forgot the details, this time everything remained clear and vivid. The king was comfortable, secure, at peace in his magnificent palace. And then this vision shattered his contentment with terror. He did what he had done before." Verse 6 and 7 tell us, "So I commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be brought before me to interpret the dream for me. When the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners came, I told them the dream, but they could not interpret it for me. This time the king told them exactly what he had seen, holding nothing back. But even with all the details laid out before them, the wise men of Babylon had no answer. They stood there helpless, unable to explain what the dream meant. Then Daniel arrived. Verse 8 says, "Finally Daniel came into my presence, and I told him the dream. He is called Belteshazzar, after the name of my God, and the spirit of the holy gods is in him." The king still called Daniel by his Babylonian name, still connected him to Babylonian deities in his language, but he also recognized that Daniel had access to divine knowledge that others didn't possess. He called it the spirit of the holy gods, showing he still didn't fully understand the one true God that Daniel served. The king began to describe his dream in detail. Verse 10 through 12 record his words. "These are the visions I saw while lying in bed. I looked, and there before me stood a tree in the middle of the land. Its height was enormous. The tree grew large and strong, and its top touched the sky. It was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and on it was food for all. Under it the wild animals found shelter, and the birds lived in its branches. From it every creature was fed." This was a magnificent tree, unlike any real tree that could exist. It reached up to touch the sky itself and could be seen from anywhere on earth. Everything about it spoke of abundance and provision. Beautiful leaves, plenty of fruit, shelter for animals, homes for birds. The entire world seemed to depend on this tree for life and sustenance. It was a picture of something strong, established, providing for countless others. But the dream didn't end with this peaceful image. Verse 13 and 14 continue. "In the visions I saw while lying in bed, I looked, and there before me was a holy one, a messenger, coming down from heaven. He called in a loud voice, 'Cut down the tree and trim off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it, and the birds from its branches.' A divine messenger appeared and commanded the tree's destruction. Everything that made it great would be torn away, branches cut, leaves stripped, fruit scattered. The creatures that depended on it would run away, and the tree that had provided for the world would be brought down. Then came the strangest part. Verse 15 records, "But let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground, in the grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth." The pronouns suddenly shifted from it to him. This wasn't just about a tree anymore. It was about a person who would be left like a stump in the ground, bound with metal, living outside with animals. Verse 16 made it even clearer. "Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times pass by for him." Whoever this tree represented would lose their human mind and think like an animal for a specific period, 7 times, whatever that meant. This was a punishment, a transformation from human to beast. The dream concluded with the messenger's explanation. Verse 17 states, "The decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict, so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes and sets over them the lowest of people." And this judgment came from heaven itself, and it had a purpose, to show everyone that God alone controlled who ruled kingdoms, and he could place anyone he wanted on a throne, even the least likely person. When Daniel heard the complete dream, something unexpected happened. Verse 19 describes his reaction. "Then Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him." The man who had confidently interpreted the first dream, who had faced death threats without fear, who had stood before the king repeatedly with divine wisdom, this same man was now troubled and silent. He understood what the dream meant, and the knowledge disturbed him deeply. The verse continues, "So the king said, 'Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its meaning alarm you.' Belteshazzar answered, 'My lord, if only the dream applied to your enemies and its meaning to your adversaries.'" Nebuchadnezzar noticed Daniel's distress and tried to encourage him to speak freely. And Daniel's response revealed everything. He wished this dream was about the king's enemies instead of about the king himself. Despite everything Nebuchadnezzar had done, despite being a foreign conqueror who had destroyed Jerusalem and taken Daniel captive, Daniel had grown to care about this king. He didn't want to deliver such terrible news. The Bible tells us Daniel was greatly perplexed for a time. Some translations say he was appalled or disturbed for an hour. This wasn't a quick pause to gather his thoughts. Daniel stood there silent, wrestling with what he knew he had to say, dreading the words that would come out of his mouth. It's a powerful picture of a prophet who loved truth enough to speak it, but who also had genuine compassion for the person who would be hurt by it. Daniel finally began to explain, and he didn't soften the blow. He started by repeating the dream's imagery, making sure the king understood each piece before revealing its meaning. Verse 20 through 22 record his words. "The tree you saw, which grew large and strong, with its top touching the sky, visible to the whole earth, with beautiful leaves and abundant fruit, providing food for all, giving shelter to the wild animals, and having nesting places in its branches for the birds. Your Majesty, you are that tree. You have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the sky, and your dominion extends to distant parts of the earth." The interpretation was direct and unmistakable. Nebuchadnezzar was the tree. Everything the dream said about the tree's greatness described his reign. He had grown strong. His influence reached everywhere. His empire provided for countless people. His power extended to the ends of the known world. Just as every creature found food and shelter in the tree, nations lived under the protection and provision of Babylon. The king's greatness had indeed reached the sky, at least in his own estimation, but Daniel couldn't stop with the flattering part. He had to continue to where the dream turned dark. Verse 23 says, "Your Majesty saw a Holy One, a messenger, coming down from heaven and saying, 'Cut down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump, bound with iron and bronze, in the grass of the field, while its roots remain in the ground. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live with the wild animals until 7 times pass by for him.'" The tree would be cut down. The king who touched the sky would fall. Then Daniel revealed what it all meant. Verse 24 and 25 contain the interpretation. "This is the interpretation, Your Majesty, and this is the decree the Most High has issued against my lord the king. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes." The decree came from God himself, from the Most High, whose sovereignty Nebuchadnezzar had acknowledged but never truly accepted. The king would be driven from his palace, from human society, from everything that made him who he was. He would eat grass like cattle, live outside in the fields, sleep under the open sky with dew covering him each morning. This would continue for 7 times, most likely 7 years, though the text doesn't specify exactly. And it would continue until the king learned one crucial lesson: that God alone controlled kingdoms and gave power to whomever he chose. The phrase 7 times appears repeatedly in this passage, and it marked the duration of Nebuchadnezzar's coming punishment. Daniel emphasized this in verse 25. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. 7 periods, 7 years, 7 seasons, 7 cycles of time would go by while the king lived as an animal. The number wasn't random. Throughout Scripture, 7 represents completeness, fullness, perfection. God would give Nebuchadnezzar a complete experience of humiliation, a full period of living without his power and reason until the lesson was perfectly learned. The transformation wouldn't be brief or symbolic. It would be long enough to fundamentally change him, to break down every bit of pride that had built up over decades of unmatched success. During these 7 times, the king would have the mind of an animal. He wouldn't just pretend to be a beast or live like one temporarily. His actual thinking would change. He would lose the ability to reason, to plan, to remember who he was. The greatest mind in the empire, the strategist who had conquered nations, would be reduced to the mental capacity of an ox grazing in a field. He would think only about food, water, shelter, the basic instincts that drive animals through their days. But there was hope buried in the judgment. The sentence had an end. Verse 26 provided the one piece of good news. The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. The tree would be cut down, but the stump would remain. His kingdom wouldn't be given to someone else permanently. When the 7 times ended, when he finally learned the lesson, everything would be given back to him. The roots would still be in the ground, ready to grow again once the king's heart changed. The condition was clear. Acknowledge that heaven rules. Not just admit it verbally as Nebuchadnezzar had done before, but truly accept it in his heart. Understand it. Live as if it were real. The problem wasn't that Nebuchadnezzar didn't know God existed or that he was powerful. The king had witnessed too many miracles to deny that. The problem was that Nebuchadnezzar still acted as if he himself were the ultimate authority, as if his own power and wisdom had built everything he possessed. Heaven needed to rule in his heart, not just in his theology. Daniel didn't just interpret the dream and leave. He cared enough about Nebuchadnezzar to offer a way out, or at least a way to delay the judgment. Verse 27 records his plea. Therefore, your majesty, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It might be that then your prosperity will continue. This was more than interpretation, it was intervention. Daniel was begging the king to change before it was too late. The advice was specific and practical. Renounce your sins. Stop doing what's wrong. Do what is right. Start living justly. Be kind to the oppressed. Use your massive power to help people instead of just expanding your own glory. These weren't religious rituals or sacrifices Daniel suggested. He called for actual change in how the king lived and ruled, for mercy and justice to replace whatever sins Nebuchadnezzar was committing. The phrase, "it might be," is important. Daniel wasn't promising that repentance would cancel the judgment entirely. He suggested it might delay it or possibly even prevent it, but he didn't make guarantees. God had issued a decree, and Daniel respected that. But he also knew that God responds to genuine repentance, that humility can change outcomes, that a heart turned toward righteousness matters more than any sacrifice. This moment shows us something beautiful about Daniel's character. He would have had every reason to want Nebuchadnezzar punished. This was the man who destroyed his homeland, killed his people, took him captive as a teenager, and ruled over him with absolute power. Daniel could have interpreted the dream and walked away satisfied that justice was coming. Instead, he pleaded with the king to change, to avoid the coming judgment, to become the kind of ruler God could bless instead of humble. Daniel wanted the king to succeed, not to fail. After hearing Daniel's warning and interpretation, Nebuchadnezzar had a choice to make. Would he take the advice seriously? Would he change his ways, show mercy, humble himself before God? The Bible tells us exactly what happened next, and verse 29 sets the timeline. All this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. A full year passed. 12 months where the king could have turned things around, where he could have proven that Daniel's warning had penetrated his heart. But the king's actions showed what he had really done with those 12 months. Absolutely nothing. He had ignored Daniel's advice completely. He continued ruling exactly as before, his pride unchecked, his heart unchanged. The year of grace ran out, and Nebuchadnezzar had wasted every day of it. He had been given time that most people don't get, a clear warning of coming judgment with specific instructions on how to avoid it, and he threw it away. The setting of what happened next is important. Verse 29 places him walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. The palace roofs in ancient Babylon were flat and served as places where kings could walk and survey their domain. Nebuchadnezzar stood high above his city, looking out over everything he had built. From that elevated position, he could see the massive walls, the temples, the hanging gardens, the Ishtar Gate, the processional way. Every monument to his own greatness spread out before him like a physical reminder of his power. In that moment, standing above his capital city, pride swelled up in the king's heart and poured out of his mouth. Verse 30 records exactly what he said. He said, "Is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" These words reveal everything wrong with Nebuchadnezzar's heart. He looked at Babylon and saw only himself. I built it, my mighty power, my majesty. God wasn't in the equation at all. The king who had witnessed Daniel interpret impossible dreams, who had seen 3 men walk out of a furnace untouched, who had just been warned by a prophet 12 months earlier. This king spoke as if he alone was responsible for everything. The phrase, "Is not this the great Babylon I have built?" shows he was speaking partly to himself, admiring his own work, congratulating himself on his achievements. He wanted to declare his greatness, to claim credit, to make sure everyone knew that Nebuchadnezzar had made all this happen. In that moment of pride, every lesson he should have learned vanished. Every encounter with God's power became meaningless. His heart revealed its true condition. The king's boastful words were still hanging in the air when judgment fell. Verse 31 tells us, "Even as the words were on his lips, a voice came from heaven. This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you." The response was immediate. Nebuchadnezzar didn't get to finish basking in his pride, didn't get to admire his city for another moment. While he was still speaking, heaven interrupted with a pronouncement that would change everything. The voice repeated what Daniel had already told him. Verse 32 continues the decree. "You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes." The judgment Daniel had warned about, the sentence Nebuchadnezzar had spent 12 months ignoring, now came crashing down on him at the worst possible moment, right when he was claiming glory for himself. Then came the transformation, and verse 33 describes it in stark, disturbing detail. Immediately, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people and ate grass like the ox. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. The word "immediately" is crucial. This wasn't a gradual decline into madness or a slow process of losing his mind. The moment the voice finished speaking, everything changed instantly. The mightiest emperor on earth, standing on the roof of his magnificent palace, suddenly lost his human reasoning. His sanity fled. Whatever had made Nebuchadnezzar who he was, his intelligence, his ability to think and plan and rule, vanished in a moment. He was driven away from people, meaning he either ran from them himself or they forced him out, unable to keep a mad king in the palace. He began eating grass like an ox, down on his hands and knees grazing in fields, no longer understanding that humans don't eat that way. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven, meaning he slept outside night after night, lying in the grass as moisture settled on him. No palace bed, no roof over his head, no servants attending to his needs. He lived completely exposed to the elements, as helpless as any animal. His hair grew long and wild, matted and tangled until it looked like eagle feathers, unkempt, uncared for, the hair of someone who no longer thought to maintain themselves. His nails grew into long, curved claws because he never cut them, never thought to, never had the human awareness that nails should be trimmed. The description paints a heartbreaking picture. This was a man who had worn royal robes, who had been attended by hundreds of servants, who had commanded armies and built wonders. Now he crawled through fields, eating grass, sleeping in the dirt, his body transforming from neglect and exposure. The greatest king of his age had become less than the poorest beggar, because at least a beggar still has a human mind. Nebuchadnezzar had lost even that. 7 times passed, 7 years of living as an animal, 7 years of eating grass and sleeping in fields, 7 years of having no memory of who he was or what he had been. But judgments from God always have purposes, and this one had an end point. The sentence was never meant to destroy Nebuchadnezzar forever, only to break his pride completely. And finally, the moment arrived when heaven decided the lesson had been learned. Verse 34 describes what happened when the 7 times were complete. At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. The king lifted his eyes toward heaven, a physical gesture that symbolized something deeper. For 7 years, he had looked down at the grass he was eating, at the ground where he slept. Now, perhaps in a moment of instinct or divine prompting, he looked up. He raised his eyes toward the sky, toward heaven, toward God. And in that instant, his mind came back. Sanity returned as suddenly as it had fled. The fog lifted, reason flooded back, and Nebuchadnezzar remembered who he was. But the man who came back to himself wasn't the same man who had fallen into madness. 7 years of complete helplessness had changed him. His first action wasn't to call for his servants or reclaim his throne. Verse 34 continues, "Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation." Praise came first. The king who had once said, "Is not this the great Babylon I have built?" now glorified God instead of himself. He called God the Most High, acknowledging supreme authority above all earthly power. He recognized that God's dominion is eternal. Unlike human kingdoms that rise and fall, God's rule never ends. His kingdom endures from generation to generation, while Nebuchadnezzar's own kingdom had proven temporary when it was taken from him for 7 years. Everything he had learned the hard way poured out in worship. Verse 35 continues his declaration. "All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, 'What have you done?'" These were the words of a man who finally understood his place in the universe. He acknowledged that all people, including himself, are nothing compared to God. God does whatever he pleases, and no one can stop him or question him. The king, who had once thought himself all-powerful, now understood that real power belonged to God alone. Then Nebuchadnezzar described his restoration. Verse 36 says, "At the same time that my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before." The moment his mind cleared, everything else followed. His honor came back. People respected him again. His splendor returned. He looked like a king once more. His advisors and nobles, who must have been ruling in his absence, sought him out and brought him back to the palace. But notice the phrase, "for the glory of my kingdom." Nebuchadnezzar didn't say, "for my own glory" this time. He connected his restoration to the good of the kingdom, not just to his personal majesty. And he acknowledged he became even greater than before. God didn't just restore what had been taken, he gave back more, showing that humility leads to true greatness, while pride leads only to destruction. The king's final words in verse 37 sum up everything he learned. "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride he is able to humble." This was his testimony, his conclusion, his final lesson. He praised God, called him the King of heaven, acknowledged that everything God does is right and just. And then he added the warning that came from his own experience. God can humble anyone who walks in pride. Nebuchadnezzar had learned this truth the hardest way possible, and he wanted everyone to know it. If this story impacted you, if it challenged you, if it reminded you of who really sits on the throne of the universe, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now. We're bringing you more biblical stories like this one, diving deep into the lives of people who encountered God in dramatic, life-changing ways. And don't keep this to yourself. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about Nebuchadnezzar's transformation. Maybe they're struggling with pride, or maybe they need to be reminded that God can restore anyone who truly humbles themselves before him. Drop a comment below and tell me, what part of Nebuchadnezzar's story hit you the hardest? Was it the dream of the statue, the 3 men in the furnace, or those 7 years he spent as an animal? I read every comment, and I want to hear what God is speaking to you through this story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Remember, those who walk in pride, he is able to humble.